Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Ryan Davis, and I'm a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, note the exit doors, which are located directly behind you and on the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag RFKLegacy, which is also listed in your program. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guests, Kerry Kennedy, Chris Matthews, and tonight's moderator, Mike Barnicle.
Chicky. Good evening. Chris, I told you someday we'd make it to Harvard. And here we are. We're going to have an evening of conversation this evening about Robert Kennedy. A lot of it is going to revolve around Chris's book, Bobby Kennedy, Raging Spirit, which covers the life and the evolution, really, of Robert F. Kennedy, a man who in his lifetime, when you read this book, still lives, despite what happened 50 years ago. And I know that many of you here, some of you here, are probably filled with angst about our current situation in the United States of America. Maybe all of you are. But before we begin, I would just like to say that 50 years ago, it was a horrendous year in more ways than one. Between 1965 and 1975, 58,000 Americans had died in a war. And in 1968, the majority of them, incidentally, between the ages of 18 and 21. And in 1968, a particularly dreadful year, 16,592 young Americans were killed in Vietnam. That's an average of about 320 per week. And in 1968, we had Tet, we had Memphis, we had Los Angeles, we had Chicago, we had cities burning, we had Richard Nixon, and we are still here, still the United States of America. And we're here to celebrate that fact tonight, to celebrate your father's life, to celebrate the country that we live in, to celebrate Chris's artistry in doing this book. And I would like to start the evening conversation by asking you, Kerry Kennedy, you were not quite 9 years of age when your father died. Did you learn anything about your dad from reading this book that you didn't know?
Well, you know, I told Chris that I hate books about my father. I hate reading them, because I'm always yelling at the author and saying that has nothing to do with reality, and you're misinterpreting and you're projecting your own psychology, screwed up psychology on him. Has nothing to do with him. So I generally really hate those books, but I love this book. Not that I agreed with everything on every page, but I loved it, and I think that the thing that's really interesting about it is that Chris came to my father from the perspective of an Irish Catholic in the 1950s and 1960s. And that perspective really gave him insights that no other author has had before. And I think that the best part of this book, in terms of comparing it to other historians, is the part about Joe McCarthy. Because people really, really misunderstand what my father was doing with Joe McCarthy.
We'll talk about that.
And Chris got it, I think, really spot on. Although, let's hear him talk.
I like that part of the book the best, too.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
That's so
because
nice.
I thought it explained the Irish in him. Someone said that he was the least assimilated Irishman in the family. He was the most Irish, the least changed by being an American. He understood loyalty and clan and character. And that's ironic for people that don't understand him. when he went to work for Joe McCarthy, because Joe McCarthy really started in January as his celebrity, if you will, his notoriety began in January of 50 with his speech in Wheeling, West Virginia to a women's group where he came out with the 205 names at the State Department. Now he's off by about 200, but he had a few of them there. But he was outrageous. He was very popular in this state, and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was the most popular McCarthy was in the country. He was much more famous than the Kennedy family in those days, much more famous than Senator Kennedy when he was elected. He was enormously popular. My mom, I would come home in the afternoon, and we just got our Admiral TV set, and Mom would be watching these black and white hearings, and only years later did I figure out what she was doing. And she was not rooting for the Army, I'll tell you that. She was rooting for Joe, and he was enormously popular. And the more he was attacked by the establishment, the media, the more the Irish stuck to him. They said, here we go again, another Al Smith. An Irishman rises up and they beat him down again. They're just waiting for one of us to make it. And of course, that Klan loyalty ignored the horrible things McCarthy did. He just ruined people's reputation. He couldn't really understand he was doing it, but he was doing it. And Bobby Kennedy was working for him as a young guy. He didn't like Roy Cohn one bit, the chief counsel. He was working as an assistant counsel. But he found something he could do on the committee that was worthwhile. He went after the British, who were secretly sending strategic war materials to the Red Chinese. The Chinese, at the very time the British and the Americans were fighting them in Korea, an outrageous situation, sending them oil and stuff like that, and getting away with it. And the Eisenhower administration was putting up with it for some weird kind of triangular diplomacy or some stupid thing they're involved with. And they hated the fact that young Bobby Kennedy had discovered that. And McCarthy, of course, brought it out publicly. But then when he saw how bad McCarthy was going with his craziness with Roy Cohn and David Schein, he broke with him. He accepted the position of Democratic counsel on that committee. And he began to really work against him. I mean, they had real almost fist fights with Roy Cohn. McCarthy was completely out of it. He was drinking heavily. He was completely out of it. He was in love politically with Roy Cohn, doing whatever Roy wanted him to do, because Roy was making him famous. He was giving him headlines every day. And there was one moment where your dad said something that was really out of the New Testament, out of Matthew's Gospel, when he said that Cohn and Schein took him up onto a mountain, Michael, and showed him all the beautiful things, if you just follow them. This is right out of the New Testament. This is the devil. And Ethel, your mom didn't recognize the connection, but he was basically saying, Bobby Kennedy was saying of Cohn and Schein, they were the devil. And they were giving him what he wanted. Besides booze, it was celebrity. And he was driving him over the cliff. And by the end of the 54, he was finished. He was censured. And by the way, just to tell you how hard it would be for the Senate to censure anybody today, including Roy Moore or anybody, they could only bring themselves to censure him. Forget they didn't expel. They never got expelled since the Civil War. Even to censure him, they had to find a way that they couldn't be establishing a standard. So they basically censured him for opposing the effort to censure him. All they could do was find some unique thing he had done, because they didn't want to be held by any standard themselves. No senator wanted to be held by this standard, abusing the power of holding hearings or investigations. They wouldn't be held by that. So they found this little nook of an opportunity to censure him. And then Bobby stuck with him, even though Bobby wrote the Democratic censure resolution destroying him. This is so Irish. He had to destroy the guy he really liked. And then he stuck with him. Your mom and dad would visit him. He'd sit in a stupor in his house with his young wife. And then later your dad, I didn't put in the book, your dad got a job for Jean's new husband. Did you know that? He was looking out for McCarthy's family even after McCarthy was dead. So they're in the airport. Your sister Kathleen told me this with your mom in 57, April it was, and they got the word over the car radio that McCarthy had finally done what he had set out to do 3 years before. He drank himself to death at Bethesda. He had a fifth under the bed and everything. He just drank himself to death, died of cirrhosis. And Bobby was your dad was so overwhelmed that he drove around the airport 3 times. And then later he snuck off to the funeral in Appleton, Wisconsin. Didn't want anybody to see it because he didn't want your uncle to get hurt. He didn't want Jack Kennedy's campaign to be hurt because the liberals were all against McCarthy by then, the Democratic establishment. There was nothing to be gained, but yet your Uncle Jack and your Uncle Teddy, both said when they were asked about Bobby, the best thing about Bobby was his loyalty to McCarthy, as ironic as that was. To me, it was just a great story of loyalty and yet good judgment in the end, but Klan loyalty.
I am struck by the fact that your family had a TV that early. I mean,
well, you want to hear the whole story. There was a time in the early 50s. Anybody here? Nobody's as old as me or you, anyway. So we all went across the road. We were right on the border with Bucks County. We all went across the whole neighborhood went to the O'Leary's to watch Superman on Monday night.
Yeah,
So there was only one TV set in the neighborhood for a while there. But
I used to watch the World Series in the furniture store window, TV in the furniture store window.
Oh, you had it hard.
Anyway,
you had it hard. We didn't have it that hard.
Kerry, I'm curious. The book, there's so much in the book. It's informative, but it's poignant, really poignant at times. And there are a couple of passages, there are many passages actually, that would bring someone who knew your father, who was acquainted with your father in a distant way, but who remembers your father and remembers the campaign for the presidency, in which he articulated and said out loud that part of him was running to find the national soul. And I'm wondering, one of the great speeches given by any politician in the 20th century, your dad gave in South Africa at the University of Cape Town. Mm-hmm. Do you ever go back and read that speech?
Funny you should mention it. We have an annual talent show on Saturday night after Thanksgiving. And I read that speech for the talent show Saturday night to my whole entire family.
Really?
64 of us. Yeah. So I love that speech. It's so interesting because it was a time, 1966, most Americans had never heard of apartheid. And Daddy went to South Africa and really challenged the white students in their moral compass to say what your country is doing is wrong, and you need to stand up and do something about it. And he did it in a very, very thoughtful and sensitive way, and he left after 4 days there, and people said, if you run, you could be president of this country now. But he talked about the challenges for anyone who seeks change, to create change, and I think those challenges are so important today for anybody who's trying to create social change. So he talked about the challenge of futility, the belief that there's nothing one person can do in the face of the world's ills. And he talked about expediency, and that's sort of the belief that there are more important things that we have to fix first, and then we can get to whatever we're doing.
For those of you who haven't read the speech, the bulk of it is in Chris's book, and Robert Kennedy, standing in South Africa, began the speech by describing a country filled with large elements of the country filled with racism, people segregated from one another, striving to make a living, the forgotten amongst us. And he paused at the end of a long paragraph of description. He said, "I'm talking about the United States of America." Mm.
And the genius of it was that he started off with our amazing parallel history, that we were founded by the Dutch. The Dutch came here. Obviously, the indigenous population, Native Americans, were here. But they came to New York, and then they were overwhelmed by the English. And it's just like in South Africa. And that's the way the Boer looks at it. They were a minority people that were overrun by the Brits. Of course, they were in the Boer War. And so as you say, as he turned, did you realize he's not talking about South Africa, he's talking about the United States. And he's saying, we're just a little bit ahead of you in the moral. We're not any different morally than you. We're just a little bit ahead of you historically. We're not better than you. And I think you had to come with that moral humility for the whites down there. And a lot of these kids were lefties. I mean, they were not all, they weren't Boers. A lot of them went to Wits. And the ones at Cape Town, I guess, a little more conservative. But I was in the Peace Corps down there in Swaziland. It's a crazy country because it's terrible right now. The whole thing's going to hell right now. But Zuma's a disaster. I mean, it's too bad Mandela was so old. He didn't have a chance to rule the country. And the guy after him wasn't much better, but we never got Cyril Ramaphosa. We never got the good leaders down there that your Uncle Ted knew all about and Greg Craig knew. The good guys never got to take over, unfortunately. But, it was weird because you'd read about heart transplants, Christian Bernard. In the same newspaper, you're reading about stupid Morality Act enforcements, about intermarriage and stuff. So at the same time, they were a highly sophisticated Western country and also stuck in this minority situation that they could only deal with through apartheid. It was just a terribly screwed up situation, which hasn't changed, unfortunately, now.
So Chris, here we are on the edge of 2018, 50 years after the campaign in 1968. And Robert Kennedy comes alive again in this book, and he becomes more important, I think, in the conversation about politics given to what we are experiencing on a daily basis today. Do you think that he is different from, different than both of his brothers? If so, how?
Well, they're all different. I mean, there's a story, your family. That's a story in itself, how different everybody is. But all the generations and all the whatever goes on there. The family dynamics, as your sister Kathleen calls them. I think that he knew the country was divided racially. That's not news. That's been going on since the 16 whatever. We've had 250 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, and whatever, 50 years of whatever you call this. I mean, it's just this. It's not getting great. It just is what it is. And it was like that in 68. That's not a million years ago. And I think he would do things that I thought maybe it seemed hokey. But when King was killed, and he had to go into that room, in that neighborhood, a tough neighborhood in Indianapolis, and I have the NBC tapes. We both benefit from that access, the tapes, and I heard a guy next to him, and Bobby said to him, "Do they know yet?" And the guy says, "No." So your job right now is to tell them. African-American community people in a tough neighborhood, the greatest hero in history, certainly from their perspective, is dead, killed by a white racist. How would you like that news to deliver? And talk about empathy. And what it took him to do that was basically take his skin off, make himself so vulnerable to that group of people that he could actually show empathy, because you can't show empathy without exposing your soul. You have to show some kind of suffering yourself to be able to be authentic. You can't go to a sick bed and say, "I got it made." That's not empathy. Empathy is showing common vulnerability. And he did it. He talked about his brother being killed by a white guy. And I remember thinking at the time how hokey that sounded, but that was his way of saying, I know pain. And I know he wasn't killed for racism like this exactly the same way, but I know pain. I'm one of you. And it was what I liked about your dad was his awkwardness, that he didn't have the polish of his brother. He had to work at it. And I thought he would drive through Gary, Indiana with Tony Zale, the middleweight champ, who people my age will remember as the guy fighting Rocky Graziano in the movie Somebody Up There Likes Me. Does everybody know what I'm talking about? In the 50s, we grew up with boxing. Okay, so Tony Zale, who had some unspellable Eastern European name, really, and all these Eastern Europeans in the town that was changing to black, and he had him on one side of himself in the convertible, and Richard Hatcher, the first black mayor, on the other side. He would drive around with the two guys just to show. I mean, it seems hokey, but you got to make these efforts. And he kept saying, you got to make an effort. And that's what Bobby Kennedy was doing. He was saying, make an effort. He said it in the King speech that night, and I think today, Trump never makes that effort. He always makes the opposite effort. He goes after Indians tonight, Native Americans. He goes after African Americans when he says the president's an illegal immigrant. From Kenya, he goes after Mexicans, saying they're all rapists. He goes after Muslims, saying they're all terrorists. Anything to divide. So we had one character, one political figure who tried to always make an effort to unite. So I don't think we have I'm running Bobby Kennedy against Trump right now. That's what I'm doing. That's why I'm here. That's what the book's about. I'm running him against, because that spirit of unity, of apathy, of having a moral compass is all that we have missed today. We don't have those elements in our leadership. And by the way, I'm just saying it, our leadership. I'm not even going to say just Trump. I don't hear anything out of Washington from either side. I hear nothing but hold on to your butt, or whatever the hell they're doing, the Republican side, hanging on to your positions, and the Democrats don't even have any idea what to say about anything. And this guy is the spirit we need today. Until I find a living candidate, I'm going to stick with him. Because I think we need that.
Excuse me, I have a great nephew, Joe, who's...
Not now!
I
Not
mean, he's
now.
great. He's
I
great.
agree. He's
So,
great.
Yeah,
I
okay.
agree.
So and there's
I agree. You know what I like about your
like
nephew?
there's over 100
You know,
of
is
us.
he
There
one
are
of only?
few who are good.
Okay,
You know,
all right.
really great.
You're beating the drum. All right. I'm not going to get in your way.
you.
I'm not going to get in your way. But he's one of the only 2 politicians I've ever met who said, "Don't use your title. Don't use my title." All the senators I've ever met, certainly John Kerry and the rest of them, they never said, "Call me John." It's always, I like that senator thing. But we're up in Mccarthy's here. We're up in Nantucket this summer, and he goes, "Joe." The only other guy to do that to me, the only other politician in a half a century to ever do that was Pat Moynihan, because he didn't need the title.
No,
He didn't need it.
Harvard man. What do you think about that? About what he's saying? But I mean, he's running your father against Donald Trump.
Well, I think I think Daddy spent much of his life. Some of his best friends said that his sort of life's mantra was "get your boot off his neck." And if you look at his life through that prism, that's really what he spent a great deal of time doing. But by 1968, he, in the speech when Martin Luther King died, he quoted Aeschylus, who said, "We should all strive to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of the world." So he had sort of switched a bit, and he was really spending a lot of his time making gentle the life of the world and spending time on Indian reservations in Bed-Stuy and the Mississippi Delta and with Cesar Chavez and with people who were really struggling. And I think one of the things that was wonderful and attractive about Daddy is that he was totally authentic. He was, as Chris said, showing his soul all the time and struggling with answers. He didn't have a smooth, pat answer to anything. He was always struggling. And in that struggle, he was giving other people permission to change, to struggle ourselves, to grapple with the issues in a way that was fresh. And I think, I think what was really most extraordinary about Daddy, because I've heard thousands of people over the course of my life talk about how he impacted them. And I think what he called forth is our better angels. Because he was so intent on moral courage, because he was so tough and willing to take on the bad guys, because he had so much empathy for people in pain, he sort of brought out the best in all of us as well and made us believe not only can I be at my best, but my community can and my country can be what I dearly wish we could become.
I remember you told me that before I started writing the book. And I listened to that one part about get your foot off the guy's neck. And I've always had that in my head. Maybe that was leading me to a lot of what I found out, what I discovered. But all the time, he was challenging people. When he would go to Notre Dame, he'd say, "You don't get your student deferments. Aren't you lucky? There's kids 18, 19, as you were saying before, are all fighting the war for you. What do you think of that? What are you going to do about it?" And he'd go to the hunters in Roseburg, of all places, Roseburg, Oregon, where they had a mass shooting a couple years ago. And he was told by the local sheriff, "Don't confront these guys. They're all lumberjacks here. They are gun guys." And he gave a speech against guns. He talked about mail-order guns that had killed your uncle and a mail-order gun. And he said, we got to just keep guns out of the hands of people who are mentally disturbed or too young. He gave all the arguments we use today about background checks. And they booed him. They said, no, these guys were tough Second Amendment types. But yet he did it. He confronted people with truth. And he was always willing to, so many politicians, as we all know, just pander. They figure out the crowd, they read it, and they sing it back to them. That's why politics is so useless today. It's just people, fundraisers and contributors being sung back to what they already know. And all speeches are endlessly pointless because all you hear in politics is echo. And that's what doesn't mean anything. And I think he was always challenging people. And he also never gave up on white working people. I am very tough about the whole Archie Bunker mentality. Let's make fun of the working guy in Queens. Let's call him the bum, the Irish guy, because he is Irish. Call him Bunker. He's an O'Malley. Come on. And the whole thing about him is let's look down on them and all. Let's have Carole King concerts and celebrate ourselves. And I tell you, that's ripping the Democratic Party in half. The working people got the message. They weren't invited to the party, and they say, screw you. And I think a big part of it is, you hear there's a party going on you weren't invited to. Bobby always, all his staff people were his social equals. His heroes were not the fifth generation types. They were Jim Whittaker, the mountain climber, Rosie Greer, John Glenn, people of accomplishment, individual accomplishment, not dynasties. He was very democratic. As your mom said, he was born a Democrat. She didn't mean capital D, she meant D, Democrat, lowercase d. And I think that was really important. And the Democratic Party has lost that. When I was a cop on the Hill, you were a cop, weren't you?
Yeah.
Capitol cop.
That's when I met Robert Kennedy.
Well, you were lucky to have Senator Kennedy. I had Frank Moss from Utah, the last liberal from Utah. And I'd sit there at night hanging out with the cops, all the West Virginia guys. And, I used to listen to them. And then one of the guys told me, the only Democratic senator who ever said hello to the cops on the way by, the others all put their noses up there, was Bobby Kennedy. The only guy to say hello to the cops, because he wasn't class-driven. And he was not against law and order. He believed law and justice worked hand in hand. He wouldn't have taken the Black Lives position against the cops. He would say, that's why they named the Justice Department building after him. He believed that law enforcement and prosecution against segregationists, mobsters, or street criminals was good for justice. He believed in the connection between law and justice. And we need leaders like that today. And we don't have any leader. I mean, maybe Sherrod Brown, maybe a few Marcia Captor, people like that, Bob Casey. They can reach back and win the Rust Belt people. But none of them are really running for president yet. And maybe Biden's won.
John Lewis?
No, I said the white working class.
Oh, yeah.
Now, we're doing fine with minorities right now, except we got to excite them. The Democratic Party has to excite the white working class and the black working class, too, because they haven't been excited by what's been offered lately.
Kerry,
Clearly.
when you were just speaking about your father and what he stood for on the public stage, in the public arena, and that's 99% of people's memories of your father is on a public stage. But when you were just speaking about him, you called him Daddy 5 times. So what do you hold on to about Daddy off the stage, at home? What do you hold on to?
Well, he was a great father. He was totally engaged with us and a lot of fun to be around. And, and he cared, and he was asking us questions and engaging us in whatever he was taking on at that moment. I have many friends, and I know a lot of people who are children of politicians, and they almost all hate politics. And they really hate campaigning in particular. But we never felt that way. Like, if you talk to my siblings, everybody loved campaigning when we were kids because he made it fun and he made it interesting. But as a father, one of my favorite stories about my father was when I was about 4 or 5 years old. I had 7 brothers and 3 sisters, so we had a lot of battles when we were kids. And one time I was playing with my brother Michael. Michael was 18 months older than me. And so we were always together, and we were playing World War II. And he was the Americans, and I was the Germans, which was never worked out very well, but for me, anyway. So we were in this treehouse, and he was lobbing these pods that looked just like grenades at my head, and magnolia pods they looked just like grenades. Anyway, so one too many hit me, and I sort of jumped out of the tree and ran up to my father's study, and the door was closed, and you were not allowed in his study if the door was closed, almost always open. But anyway, I opened it up, and I ran and jumped in his arms, and he wrapped his arms around me, and he said, "What happened?" And I told him. And he said, "Go get Michael." And I said, "Okay." And I was like, "Michael, justice is going to be done." And I brought him up, and Daddy said, "Now, Kerry, tell what happened." And I told the whole terrible story. And then he said, "Okay, now you be quiet and don't interrupt. And Michael, you tell what happened." He had a very different story. But, that took a lot of time, hearing both of his kids and going through this whole thing. And then he made us kiss and make up and go to our rooms and read for an hour. And I think that he was a fantastic father in that way, but he was also, what he was saying to us is what he believed in for our country, which is you have to get along with one another. You know, you think somebody's your enemy, but actually it's your brother. You got to figure out how to get along. And peace is not something just to pray for. It's something that we all have a responsibility to seek every day. And then you got to read.
Did he tell you next time, don't be a German?
Don't be a German. He did not give me that advice.
Chris, you know,
It sounds like what I thought, because, you know, the kids who feel they're less favored by the other kids have to resort to justice, to fairness. He used to say, that's not fair, that's not fair, when he was a kid, because his big brothers were the sort of the highlights of the family, you know, and he had to compete with them, even though he was much younger. And that's not fair just sounds so true. By the way, it's always amazing when I hear your family stories, how they're similar to other families, because we think of the Kennedys as unique and all that, but this fighting and this playing the Germans, and we realized everybody did that. You know, it's just and tuna, you guys, tuna fish on Friday, grilled cheese. I mean, everything is so Catholic. You know, it's so amazing. Just every time I read these, your mom getting the Pope to make her a grilled cheese sandwich. That great story over in Poland. Some guy's hanging around the cardinal.
Wasn't the Pope
No, he wasn't the Pope then. And he was hanging around, and she said she's hungry, and she said that one of these priests hanging around the cardinal primate of Poland, could you have a grilled cheese sandwich? The guy goes racing off and comes back and gives her a grilled cheese sandwich. And then later on, when he's Pope, they were talking. He says, "Yeah, I'm the guy that made the grilled cheese sandwich for you." It's so Catholic Friday lunch thing. Did you have fish sticks too? I mean, that's it seemed to go with it, you know.
Pull that Catholic thread a little. I mean, you have Robert Kennedy, Catholic family. But in a way, he's the only one of the Kennedys who was clearly identified on the public stage as a Catholic because of his acquaintances. Dorothy Day, influenced by Dorothy Day. Michael Harrington wrote The Other America, a book that you could apply to today. Cesar Chavez, the migrant workers in California. All of that, you could just talk about it as if it were happening today. But Robert Kennedy, deeply Catholic, small c and capital C.
He wasn't just he was devotional, and I think he loved the devotions of being an altar boy. I'm sure he knew all his Latin. And but also later on, he tried to figure out what was the religious motivation of people like Cesar Chavez. He wanted to know what was the connection between their Roman Catholicism and getting up and leading the labor movement in California among California workers, Chicanos as we call them then. And what got Dorothy Day to work in the Bowery. And later, I'm sure, if he had lived in our time, he would have said Mother Teresa. What was it that drove her religiously? What takes her from morning mass to doing good works? What's the connection in the soul? And he was trying to figure that out. And it was all real with him. And Leo the 13th, I'm sure he understood Rerum Novarum and the idea of the Catholic social goals and, against child labor and civil and Social Security, and all the good things that came eventually into the New Deal came about from the encyclical of Leo the 13th. So he knew all that. Most Catholics don't know that, but he did. And he was also really into Michael Harrington. And the differences between Kennedy and Johnson is, with Johnson, everything was gross and big and had to be the great society and big this and big that and big government and big bureaucracies. And that was Johnson's culture. That's where he came from. The Kennedys in both of them were much more about finesse and like the Green Berets. Do it well. Don't do it big. Do it well. Get it done, but don't gross it up, and don't have it turn it into a big bureaucratic state. They were not social democrats in the sense of big government. It was always community level. In New York, of course, Bobby, your dad was trying to do community, trying to get the people involved, and so it was very much subsidiarity. In fact, the more I talk about it, the more it sounds like the Catholic social philosophy and political philosophy. He was up to date on it.
It's funny what you're saying about the difference between him and Johnson, and also Jack and Johnson. When in the 1964 Democratic Convention, Daddy gave that speech, and he was going to get up and talk about Jack, and there was a 20-minute standing ovation. And it's one of the most moving film clips to see him struggling with going up and talking to people, and the crowd just wouldn't let him speak. But he quoted Shakespeare, and it's about Jack, but what he quoted also is a reference to Johnson.
The garish son.
The garish son. So he says, when he shall die, cut him up into little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so bright that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun. And so that was a reference to, that was the difference, that poetry, that being in love with night, with the stars, with nature, and not with the harshness of
I love the
Johnson.
backstory to that, the way Johnson, to screw Kennedy and the family, put him down in the basement, way down. I grew up around there on the shore, Ocean City. Our parents had a house down there, so I knew all about the Atlantic City, the convention hall and all that. I was a busboy down there at that weekend. In fact, they buried him way down in some hole in the bottom, like some medieval dungeon. They had him get ready. That was his green room to get him ready for that speech. And it's a horrible, every little trick in politics, Johnson, everybody did. Your dad did those things too, these tricky little things of getting the other side off base and wrong-footed. But the idea that he sat afterwards and he was so moved by the fact that his brother wasn't there anymore, and this was a speech for him, and that reaction from the audience was for Jack, that he sat on the fire escape and cried afterwards. It was all this stuff we didn't see on TV. But,
two things. He had a TV in the 50s, and he had a house at the shore.
Yeah.
I can do it the other way. We were so poor.
Chris, you know,
We were middle.
that is one of the more emotional TV clips that anyone will ever watch. The 22-minute ovation as Robert Kennedy was about to be introduced and trying to quiet the crowd, unable to. And it went on and on and on. And then he runs for the United States Senate and he wins. But and all of this is in this marvelous book, obviously. But am I mistaken to think that I gauge the growth of Robert Kennedy in his career as a politician, a hesitant politician, I would add in my estimation, that his growth was partially fueled by rage, outrage at some of the things he saw. In the mid-60s, I think probably 65 or 66, they established something in the Senate called the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition. I think George McGovern was the chairman. And your father went on a tour of the Mississippi Delta, Kentucky, Appalachia,
Joe Clark.
West
He went with
Virginia.
Joe Clark too.
And
Pennsylvania. Yeah.
he came back into an untrained ear, an untrained ear. There was a sense of outrage in him then that hadn't existed prior to that. Am I wrong?
Well, I don't know about that. I think that he talked about the ancient pyramids, and he said there's graffiti in there that says no one was angry enough to speak out, and we have to be angry enough to speak out when we see injustice. So he knew how to harness outrage and anger and put it towards a positive end. But I don't know that, I think that he had outrage at injustice and indignation at people who were harming people who were weaker throughout his life. You know, he was the seventh child. As the seventh child, I can tell you, you appreciate justice at a very young age. And defending people who are weak. And I think, people often say that he changed dramatically when Jack died, and I think that Uncle Jack's death really did have an enormous impact on him. But in he did an interview with David Frost, which was maybe the last interview he did, one of the last interviews he did. And it's really interesting. It's on YouTube if you ever want to look. But he says David Frost asked him about his change, and he said, I had a very different role when I was working for my brother. And if you think about it, he really did. His job then was different from when he became a politician, and he could then express in a much different way who he was and what his passions were and what was most important to him.
I think I don't think anybody changes 180. I do think that one of your members of your family told me
Is it change or is it growth? I'm talking growth.
Well, I think he, as this member of the family told me to sort of help me along on this, said at some point in your life you decide that the life's villains, whoever they be, Roy Cohn, Jimmy Hoffa, whoever, create their own hells on earth eventually. They end up creating hell on earth. So why don't you focus on the victims? And he did. He began to focus on all those people and victims. And I think that trip down to the Mississippi Delta was probably the most glaring thing he had ever seen. He saw kids in the United States with distended stomachs who were living on molasses, which is just enough sugar to keep walking every day, but you're dying. You're definitely dying, and all you eat is molasses. And he comes back to your family. Were you there in that? Well, you were there. What am I talking about? You were there. You walked back to the family, and there's this big, wealthy American family having great dinners and no booze, but great food, as Jack would say. And say, you did not know how lucky you are. And he just kept confronting you with that. And I think that was a moment of learning. I think Arthur Schlesinger, I think is fantastic, said, my wife Kathy's here, and we heard him once say at Aspen Institute that politics is essentially a learning profession. And that's what I really have against Trump and a lot of these people running both parties now. They don't ever get any better. They should get better at it, They're learning supposedly each day for the next day, but it seems like Groundhog's Day with these people. It's always the same stupid performance that some staff person wrote for them. And it's boring because they don't put anything into it. And Bobby was always learning, and he learned about McCarthy not being right. He learned about this Vietnam War being wrong. He learned about civil rights, and he came to that. He came to understanding a lot of these things by constantly exposing himself to the farm workers in California. He didn't want to go on that trip, but he went. And he met Cesar Chavez. It changed a lot in him. He didn't want to, what are we doing down here? We're going down to Mississippi Delta. And he learned. He constantly exposed himself to learning. And they don't do that. The hardest thing is to walk into an uncomfortable situation. I hate doing it, learning something new. And politicians that's the one thing they should be good at, is learning the people they represent all the time and getting better at being a politician. And he was. And I think at the end he was still growing, and he wanted to keep going. And my God, we always look at history backwards. He didn't know he was going to get shot. Jack didn't know he was going to be shot. They're looking forward. That night, he was planning how to try to get McCarthy to join up with him. Maybe give McCarthy the Secretary of State job. He needed to unite the anti-war people because the hump was out there with all the establishment backroom pals behind him. He had to beat Humphrey and the Johnson organization. That was tough. With the anti-war people being split between him and V. McCarthy, who was a hell of a politician, and I was a very attractive one, he had to unite. And so he's thinking at the end he had to do that. Like Jack Kennedy was thinking at the very end, why is Dallas so right-wing, and why is Fort Worth so yellow dog Democrat? He's trying to figure that out with Connolly and Jim Wright to the very end. These are political people trying to learn all the time, right to the end. They don't know when the end's coming. They're trying to get better. And they're really trying to make it, and they want to live. They're not part of this story as we're looking back at it. They're part of the story they're living, and they're trying to make it. That's the real horror of this story. The real tragedy is that your dad and your uncle were trying to get better even at the end, and it's unbelievably positive, except it's horrible. And that's why I wanted to write, never thinking about the assassinations when I wrote these books. I never wanted to think about because I wanted to write about who they were as living people. And let somebody else write about the killers. I don't like those people. Let somebody else write about them. But I think that's the positive story of your dad. Right to the end, he's trying to make it, and he wasn't wasting anybody's time. He was thinking how he and McCarthy could get into cahoots and win that thing at the end.
I think you're right about what motivated him and what excited him, and how much he loved learning. He was always, he'd shave in the morning and be listening to Shakespeare. He was always getting us to memorize poetry and, challenging himself physically, intellectually, morally. He wasn't afraid of any of that, and he thrived on it. And the only thing that I would disagree a little bit on, Chris, is the idea of him going out to be with the victims, because it's amazing when you look at his speeches and also his commentary. He never talked to any of the people he worked with as victims. He always said, and Dolores Huerta says this, he was important to us because he was the first person who didn't say, I have the solutions, but said, how can I help you? He saw people as partners. He understood that people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And that idea, that concept, has taken, 40 years, 50 years for the rest of people working on social justice to catch up to. But that was his stance.
So do you think, the both of you used the word victims, but if you look at Robert Kennedy from a distance, and the people that he was most comfortable with, the farm workers, the poor, the hungry, the afflicted, the lonely, the elderly, I think he viewed them as casualties, not victims. Casualties of a system that was then and is now rigged against so many people who don't have access, don't have clout, don't have reach. Agree or disagree?
Well, again, I don't think he would talk about them in those terms. I think that he would talk about people in terms of dignity and capacity and inherent honor, and then that's one part of it, and the other part of it is get your boot off his neck. He wanted to stop that system. He wanted to change that system. And he wanted to work with them, learn from them what needs to be changed, what role can I play in helping that.
He liked Jack Newfield, who I love. He wrote the first inspiring book. I love the Schleusner and Ed Thomas books, but Jack Newfield was the best. And he said to Bobby, his people were, he said, cops, waitresses, and firefighters are my people. That's what he felt. He also loved the Poles of Indiana, of Gary, rather than the West Side liberals. He said the West Side liberals are spending all the time worrying about what party they weren't invited to.
That's the Upper West Side of Manhattan.
And he didn't like that kind of snotty liberal. He didn't like them. He liked people that were admitted that they needed something to get done. So and they were part of that. I mean, he maybe I'm fashioning the guy I want to be myself. I just like this guy. I like the fact that he believed that the cops could be the good guys and should be the good guys, and it wasn't all cops are bad guys. He would never buy into the fact that Archie Bunker was the bad guy. He would never buy into that liberal sort of notion that you're superior to the people, the working people. And yet he sat with Cesar Chavez when he ended his fast. He felt some kind of personal connection with this guy. And I do think we need some leaders like this. I don't know whether you say left or right. I don't think he fit either sort of notion. I think, I don't know, this country is looking for something besides what it's got, and it's always looking for something else, whether it's Bernie or it's George Wallace or it's this guy we got now. They're always looking for some savior from the establishment, and because they don't think the establishment's done it. And they think they're just a fundraising machine, which is what both parties are now, fundraising machines, listening to their fundraisers and talking to their fundraisers and telling their fundraisers what they want to hear so that we'll keep giving them money so they can keep getting reelected, so they can keep giving their speeches to their fundraisers. I'm sorry, that's the wheel we're on. And it's really boring. It's really boring, intellectually empty. And Pelosi's done some good work over the years. I really think she's a tougher speaker than Tip was. In many ways, she's been great at disciplining the party. When I listen to her now, I don't hear anything growing. I think it's time. I think Schumer is so smart, but I don't hear anything from him. They spend so much time raising money and kissing the butt of their fundraisers that when 95% of their time is gone, they got 5% left for thought. And they can barely read the paper with that 5% now and keep up with us. And so it's pretty drained, the political system right now. And I think that Bobby had advantages. He was wealthy enough to not to raise money. He was wealthy enough to live well and to just keep all his heart and soul into his politics. And that's an amazing advantage. But I don't see anybody like this now.
Well, I have to say that what I found with Trump, in the age of Trump, is that people are realizing I cannot count on my political leaders. And they've realized that over the last 40 years. I can't count on journalists, I can't count on political leaders, I can't count on the church, I can't count on the CEOs. So all these structures have come sort of tumbling down. But what people are realizing is I can count on myself. I can count on my friends. I can get people together and we can create change. And that, I think, is, there's a moment here, there's a capacity here to inspire people to take back our democracy and take back our country and band together and say, we're going to create change. Might not be change across the country, but we can change our community, or we can change our school, or we can change something. And that's very, very heartening.
So,
I think the press is doing a good job, though. I think we got a great New York Times now.
Washington Post,
And the
absolutely.
Washington
I think they're
Post.
God
It's
save.
amazing.
I think
Yeah.
they're
Before we
amazing
take a-
reporting lately, and they have 40 or 50 people in both papers. Thank God for Jeff Bezos just paying for it and staying out of the way. And they're doing it. The New York Times has been spectacular. We had him on again tonight, Peter Baker. These people. Mike Schmidt took down Bill O'Reilly one day and went after Trump the next day. Said, how do you do this? How do you have the time and the brains to do what you guys have been doing lately? That's why Trump hates them.
So before we take a few questions from the audience, you brought us back to where we began the evening, 1968, when the foundation started getting chipped away at, and all of these bricks were removed in terms of people's faith in various institutions. And this book brings us to today. And if you just change a few verbs and nouns in the book, Iraq and Afghanistan instead of Vietnam.
Yeah.
The
absolutely.
others.
Yeah.
The others today instead of the disenfranchised or the forgotten in 1968. The politics of revenge and vengeance in 1968. The politics of absurdity and true absurdity today. To your campaign, Chris, that you're going to run Robert Kennedy against Donald Trump. How do you do it?
That's a conceit.
Well, go ahead.
I'm going
anyway.
back to something about what the Democratic Party has to do to rebuild itself and to offer a decent challenge, or the traditional Republican Party. People like Kasich and the ones I grew up with, like Bill Scranton and Tom Ridge. Christy Whitman and Henry Cabot Lodge. That party, Jack Javits, that's sort of faded now, but that has to come back. That has to come back and have some pride. And instead of just having a survivor like Mitch McConnell, who's a pretty smart survivor, I must say. When I was working as a Capitol cop, there's an old West Virginia guy who pulled me aside. And this is when we had the same kind of split between the long hairs and the hard hats. There's 1971, the Vietnam War's still hot. It's about between town and gown. It's the same class division we got now. Town and gown, where the gown was the long hairs, the anti-war people, and the hard hats were the guys, the working class guys without a college education. They were all for the war. Or at least they were against the long hairs. It wasn't quite clear where they were, but they were definitely against the long hairs. And the flag burners. And this guy named Leroy Taylor, he's a white guy from West Virginia, he had been an MP in the Army. And he was working as a Capitol policeman. We got to meet a lot of these guys. They weren't all patronage guys like you and me. They were real country guys working there. And he called me aside. This was during the moratorium and all the big demonstrations in the Capitol. And he called me one day aside as the college kid, had been in the Peace Corps for 2 years, and he called me aside and he said, "Do you know why the little man loves this country? Do you know why the little man loves this country?" And I waited for the answer. He said, "Because it's all he's got." And if everybody would just listen to that, they'd understand a lot about American patriotism of the working guy, the guy with nothing. And his flag is everything to him, and his country's everything. He doesn't have a beautiful family, he doesn't have all the money in the world, doesn't have anything really except he's got his country. In many cases, he had served it in the army. And that love of country, that gut patriotism, is what was saluting your dad along that train tracks those days. That gut patriotism, when you cry a little bit when you hear the Star-Spangled Banner. And that was real, and that's going for the Democratic Party right now. And they have got to get it back. They've got to get back the gut patriots. And they don't seem to know how to, they don't seem to want to do it. They don't want to buckle to it. They don't want, and that really bothers me. Why don't they want to do it?
They don't know how to do it.
Maybe not, but they don't want to do it, and they don't want to do it. And the liberal intellectuals don't want to reunite with them. They'd rather reunite with the college-educated women from the suburbs. That was Hillary's plan. Oh, that's a great idea for a coalition. Because in the end, they voted Republican. Big surprise. Oh boy, they're going to become Democrats overnight because of a woman candidate. No, they're going to be Republicans. You got to find people with the same economic interests you have and build a party around it. That's my hunch.
We have 2 microphones for questions for Chris and Kerry.
Just while we're waiting, can I introduce my niece who's here, Claire Kennedy. She just started. She's a freshman at Harvard. So proud of you.
I have people here.
Well, I have people.
Dave Tiki over here from Holy Class of 67. My friend Dave Tiki. And he's here. Lee Pendergast over here worked for me with Tip O'Neill for 11 years or something like that. My daughter's here, Caroline, who's a Harvard, what do you call it? You're at Kennedy School. She's getting a joint degree here in Stanford Business, getting a joint degree this year. Our friend Hector, Hector. What's your name? Hector, from England, smart guy. My wife Kathleen, who's without doubt a gorgeous preacher. Jennifer Donaldson, of Donaldson fame, Sam's daughter. Great person. My former executive producer. Who else? See? Yeah. I got people. And Eddie Jesser and Connie Kostelnik are here. The best political minds in the city. They are. They are.
Luckily, there's no competition up there.
Yes, sir. Could you give your name and...
Jay Gleason. One of the prominent planks in RFK's 68 campaign was to give 50 Phantom fighter jets to Israel. This was a year and a half after the occupation had started. He'd also been a cub reporter in the Mandate Palestine in 48 during the Nakba. Why did he pander to the Israel lobby? Why didn't he tell them to get their boots off the Palestinians' necks? This is perhaps a sensitive subject.
Have you been following me around? Didn't you do this to me the other night somewhere?
Pardon me?
Didn't you do this to me somewhere else?
No, I've never done it to you, but I'm glad to get a chance.
They sense a resonance here, but anyway. I don't know. Do you want to do this?
Well, I'll tell you what I think, which is the Palestinians were against Israel. They were surrounding. Israel was a tiny little country that was surrounded.
Well, Israel was Palestine. They were forcibly displaced.
Okay. At that time, it was... it was very, very vulnerable, and it was surrounded by enemies who were intent on destroying it. And my father stood up saying, get your foot off his back, off his neck, and that's why Saran killed him. So I think, whatever you're trying to say, sir, my father really stood up for what he believed in, and he paid a terrible price for that. Thank you.
So my question's kind of a good lead after that. So my name is Ryan. I'm a junior at the college. I was wondering what some of the challenges are in guiding the legacy of a loved one, especially considering the fact that few people know them as well as the friends and family of that person, but it's the influence of the general population that guides the direction of that legacy.
Thanks for that question, because I run Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, so I think about those issues a lot, and especially as each year moves on, there are fewer and fewer people who remember my father. So when Jack died, a lot of people said to Daddy, that they had lost hope. And my father was sympathetic to that, but he didn't believe in it. He really thought that you had to learn the lessons from Jack's life and try and carry them forward. And so that's really what Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights does. It's not about looking back. It's really about taking those values and vision for a more just and peaceful world and applying it to the problems that we face as a country and as a world today. And that's what we do. We do it on in education, we do it on human rights issues, litigation at home and abroad, and we do it with the financial services community. But that's what we're looking at. Thank you.
My name is Braden. Okay, my name is Braden. I'm a freshman at the college. This question's for Mr. Matthews. So you talk a lot about your disappointment in today's politicians and their pandering of votes. So my question is, are you hopeful for the near future? Do you think that there's an RFK in the ranks of today's politicians? And if not, how do you think that we fix it?
Who do you like?
I kind of like Martin O'Malley, but he got 3% of the vote.
Why?
Why did he get 3% of the vote, or why do I like him?
Both. Both are good questions. You like it, but nobody else does. I just want to, well, what do you think is the answer to your quizzical nature here?
Well, I agreed with a lot of his policies, and I felt like...
Are you from Baltimore?
I'm from Mississippi.
Well, why? Oh, never mind.
We didn't have a lot of Democrats representing Mississippi.
Well, what do you think? There's a whole 15 people running, probably. Do you think Biden's too old?
I'm sorry?
Do you think Biden's too old?
I think so, yeah.
How many people here think Biden's too old? How many people think he's fine? That's an interesting situation. It's about even. That's about right. That's better than most people do. They think he's okay.
Is Bernie
But
too
you want to
old?
know what? I'm sorry.
I want to know if you're hopeful for the near future.
Not necessarily.
Then how do we fix it?
Well, I think, listen to me. If I didn't believe it, I wouldn't say it. Listen to me. I believe I know what I'm talking about. I think the Democratic coalition has to be rebuilt. I think it's blown itself apart over cultural issues more than anything else. It's one thing to be pro-choice, but don't talk about it all the time. Don't make it a defining issue of the party. Don't say you can't be a Democrat if you're pro-life. Don't say that. It doesn't achieve anything. We got a pro-choice situation. The Supreme Court's got a decision. We stick with it. I think we got to stop dividing ourselves over culture on purpose. But fundraising is based upon division. You have to tell the people when you ask them for $100,000, whatever, how vital it is this fight is, and you got to get something close to them. And it's usually something like choice to fight over. It's not about jobs or wages or economic development of this country, which still needs to be developed economically, right from New York to Washington State. It's not getting done. Infrastructure, things like that are boring, but they have to get done. People have to create real good jobs, and we have to catch up with the rest of the world, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Europeans. Just go vacation, and you're on a train that goes 300 miles an hour. And we're back here with this buckboard, this Amtrak joke. And we don't have anything uniting the country, so we have polarized east and west coast. It's just circles underneath, and we fly across, and we laugh at them. What are there circles down there? Well, they're people. That's America down there. We have to reunite the country. Somebody has to talk big. And they don't. They're scared to death. Democrats are afraid to be called big spenders, so they don't say anything. So they quibble over a tax cut. You're losing already. I went after it tonight, but you're going to lose. If all you do is talk about the Republican tax cut, you're going to lose, because they'll finally figure out a tax cut that will pass, and they'll have gotten something done, and you'll have gotten nothing. And they got to stop playing defense and start offering something, and that takes guts. And the fundraisers don't ask for that. The fundraisers just hit them with the social issues. Let's all get together and celebrate ourselves again. Let's have another Carole King concert. That'll do it. It's the same elite crap that has made the Democratic Party an elite party, and nobody wants to join it anymore. I'm sorry. That's all I think, and you agree with me. I know you agree with me, Barnicle.
I agree with you partially.
Oh, partially.
I think it's
much more complicated than that.
well. I just walk around, go grocery shopping,
Oh, here we go.
bump into people. And I think it's a little bigger than that, and I think it begins in about the 5th grade. And I think it's largely revolving around the fact we don't know who we are. We don't teach our own story to our children. They don't know about America. They don't know what it is. They don't know about parents coming here from Ireland or Italy or any place in the world. Nobody's knocking on the door to get into Poland. They want to come here because we're free. And we don't tell our own story. Our children don't know it. They learn about it on TV. They don't learn it about from life lessons, from seeing people in politics who just talk gibberish. Tell our own story. That lights the fire. It brings out the sunshine, and things would change.
Okay, I think you guys should stop whining and
We're
run
not
for
whining.
office.
We're preaching. We are preaching.
I'm not
know.
whining. I'm just saying, you know.
Well, I know,
Chris
but
is
I mean,
absolutely
you know,
right. Chris is absolutely right. There are 535 people who go to Washington to represent us. Maybe 530 sit on their ass. There's maybe 5, maybe a handful who will stand up and speak the truth. At what risk? Losing an election? Big deal. Yes, sir.
My name is Tamer Ahmed. This question is for Mr. Matthews. I just graduated from Hey, everybody. My name is Tamer Ahmed. This question is for Mr. Matthews. I just graduated from the college this past May. We seem to complain about there not being a leader or any leader right now that's elected to be that leader that we're waiting for. But it seems that any single medium that any new leader comes out of is so polarized. You seem to be a great, I watch you every single day and you're a great person, but for a Fox News viewer, you're the devil no matter what you say.
I know.
And it seems to be for any elected politician. So what are your thoughts
Well,
on
we're
that?
going to have 2 political parties. That's not going to change. That's the way we work. It's the way it works. And we're going to have a left and a right. So they're givens. The question is, are we going to have a governing majority in either side to get something done? And that means winning the center. That means bringing back the people that are in play. And who's in play right now? The white working class. They're in play. They're the ones that go back and forth. The near suburbs, right outside the city, that area that can switch back and forth, which does switch back and forth. The people with some money but not much, who have roots in the Democratic Party but are tired of it and they're disappointed with it. If you don't get them back, you'll lose Meehan's district next time. You'll lose Fitzpatrick. I'm going to all the suburban districts. I can point to them. Charlie Dent. And these are the ones I'm familiar with. These are the districts that switch. And if you keep losing them, as the Democrats have been doing, you're not going to get to 218. I think they have a good shot at doing it this time, just out of playing sheer defense. Just, it's easy because Trump has made such a disaster of this. But he's embarrassed himself in the suburbs. I think he'll still get the rural areas, but I think he's embarrassed himself in the suburbs of New York, Chicago, and Philly, and those kind of places. They're just embarrassed to be for Trump now. So they may unfortunately win an easy one this time and say, oh, we've got it figured out. So they win a House back, and Mancy's back on the catbird seat. Then what? Anything good coming out of that? Probably not. And so we have a divided government again, and nothing gets done for the next 2 years. So, I mean, that's really what we're facing now. The Democrats probably getting back the House, not getting back the Senate, and maybe getting back the Senate, but still it'll be divided government. Nothing's going to get done. And that always helps conservatives, because every day you prove the government can't do anything, you make their conservative argument. Every time nothing gets done, the conservatives win the argument. And so I'm not hopeful until somebody comes along and says, here's what Democrats stand for.
So let's talk about Barack Obama, because he did actually bring together that coalition of left and right, and he appealed to people, and he gave people this enormous amount. I'm talking about the first run. And he gave people this enormous amount of hope, and he put forth a vision of unity and working together.
Yeah, he did. I was an Obama fan. But he faded. He faded on us. He just did. I can't explain why he did. He just did. He didn't follow up with health care and selling it after you sell it. I mean, this is where, I don't want to get into political critiquing. I think that Obama sold affordable care brilliantly. And then he thought that was done. He moved on to the next project. What Reagan taught me, watching Reagan from the other side, was you got to sell the car, then sell people how much they like the car. You got to keep selling it and selling it, our program, as an ongoing thing rather than as a one-stop. You've done this now. You have to keep saying over and over again our program of tax cuts. Because Obamacare didn't go away when it was passed. It was beginning when it was passed. He had to sell it while it was working. He had to keep behind it because people had to sign up for it. He had to be out there pitching people, young people who are healthy, to sign up for it. Because that's the one thing that the Republicans are now doing. They're taking out the individual mandate, and that's what they really want to do, is get the healthy people and the young people not to be part of it. Because, everybody's healthy and young when they're 25, 35, 45. Everything's going great, except in some cases. It's later on that you need health care. That's why I've pooled risk. That's what's called insurance. And if you only have older, unhealthy people in a system, which is where we're headed, it's not really insurance, it's just maintenance. It's just expensive, and the premiums will go through the roof, and that's what Trump wants. And he may get it this Friday. They may get this bill through. And if they get it through, they've cut it out from underneath, and I think failure to sell. I don't want to get into critiquing Obama. I did think he was a really good president, and he inspired me, and I thought he was clean as a whistle. His family was admirable beyond belief. And the worst racists in the country hated him most because he was perfect. They hated the fact he was clean. They hated the fact that he wasn't a money grubber, that he went into community service, that he never did anything wrong, that he was a perfect dad, a perfect husband. They hated that because he was black. That's why a lot of them didn't like him. And no matter what he did, the more he did better things, the more they hated him for being better. And he was a little aloof. I'll give him that. I'll give you that. But if you're asking for that, but
Kerry.
I don't like doing this. He's better than anybody who's come along in a long time. Better than Clinton. Better than either Clinton, I think. Oof. Take it on the chin. Take it on the chin.
I guess, when my father ran for president, incidentally, if you have not recently read, I was just looking for this in the book, but there's no.
What page you want?
No, there's no.
What are you looking for?
I'm looking for his announcement speech. Do you have that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to read this to you. Just like the first 6 lines, you are not going to believe this announcement speech. How much it resonates today. Yeah, we'll find it.
Right there.
Okay. He says, I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, and I feel that I'm obliged to do all that I can. And Chris says, but it's what he said next that held such power and still would today. I run to seek new policies to end the bloodshed in Vietnam and in our cities, policies to close the gaps that now exist between black and white, between rich and poor, between young and old, in this country and around the rest of the world. I run for the presidency because I want the Democratic Party in the United States of America to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation of men instead of the growing risk of world war. Now there's another part that's not quoted here, but where he says, I run because I'm convinced that the only way to make these changes is by changing the men who are making the decisions today. I mean, right? So my closing is we have an extraordinary country, and we can be a country that's about justice and peace and compassion towards those who suffer. We can do that in this country, and that's what we need to do. We need to do it in our own lives. We need to do it in our communities. We need to do it nationally. And this group of people we're among the most privileged people on earth. And everybody here is here because you're interested in politics. So let's find ways of working together, of finding one another and saying, we're going to take back our country. We're going to make something of this place, and we're going to be proud to hand it on to the next generation.
So we all know who the people who we pick as president are. We choose among them. They pick themselves. We don't pick them. They choose themselves. And then we look at the array of candidates, and among those who've chosen them, like student council. Nobody ever gets somebody else to run for student council. You run because you want to run. And so it's going to be Kamala Harris, or it's going to be Garcetti, or it's going to be Amy Klobuchar, or it's going to be Elizabeth Warren, or it's going to be Kirsten Gillibrand. I don't think her, but she's in the running. It's going to be an array of people in their 40s or 50s, and it's going to be an interesting group. I don't think Bernie might run again. I don't know if he wins. I think it's always possible, but Bernie and Joe may we'll see. But I hope it's somebody in their 40s or 50s who comes out, and I think it's, I don't like the word attractive. That's what everybody says, oh, they're an attractive candidate. Let's move on from that. How about proven? Do something that shows that you've done something. And I remember Huey Carey running on the motto, David Garth wrote it for him. Before somebody tells you what they're going to do, first ask them what they've done. And I thought that got him elected over Howie the Horse. So I think we're all looking now. We have 3 years to look for some proof of leadership. And it's, I'm afraid there aren't many Democratic governors out there. That would have been a nice hunting ground to find people, but we don't have many of those. I'd like to see Kasich come on and challenge Trump from the Republican side. I really like John Kasich. And I think that would be a good challenge no matter what comes of it. But I do think we got to get excited again about not moving left necessarily at all. It's not moving left. I don't understand this whole thing about setting up some rule that you have to be for single payer to be a Democrat. I don't think you have to be any, forget the rules. We need leaders. And I think it's a great time. If anybody, I've told people this, if you're going to run for Congress, run now. This is the chance. Tom Foley got elected. You get elected in waves, and then you get defeated in waves. Live with that. It's the way it works. Tom Foley came in a wave and went out in a wave 20 years later. But get on that surfing, body surf into the next. There are going to be so many people elected to Congress next November that didn't have a prayer. And they're going to be in there because this was the time to run. So if you're thinking of running, tell anybody you know, run, because you might win. And if you don't run, you definitely will not win. It's so simple. And I really think it's the great time to, I know you hate raising money. I hate it. My wife, by the way, is the Democratic Party chairman of Maryland right now. You can check in with her if you want to get involved in Maryland politics. But I think she's got things under control there. But anyway, it's a great time to run. I think Trump needs challengers. He's scared to death of Elizabeth Warren. Go home and read the papers tomorrow morning. I saw it today. He is so scared of her. He's calling her that stupid nickname again. And it was sort of funny the first time, you know. Howie Carr enjoyed it, you know, the first time, but not 100 times. Because after a while, it begins to sound like you're making fun of the Indians. You're not making fun of her anymore. And nobody's going to tell them to stop, so the voters have to do it.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.